I never thought a single joke could change everything about my life. I mean, who expects that one awkward moment at a bookstore could lead to questioning everything you thought you knew about love, age, and taking chances? But there I was, standing, in front of a woman who had just turned my world upside down with 7 simple words. I'm 52. Does that change anything? And honestly, I had no idea. What I did know was that my ridiculous comment about asking out a 45-year-old had just opened a door I never expected to walk through. This is the story of how one embarrassing joke led to the most unexpected chapter of my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dylan, and I'm 34 years old. I know what you're thinking. Not exactly the age where you expect life-changing romance stories, right? Well, you'd be wrong. I work as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm here in Portland, Oregon. It's one of those jobs that sounds creative and exciting when you tell people at parties, but the reality is mostly designing brochures for local dentists and creating social media posts for coffee shops that all look exactly the same. Don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining. The job pays well enough for my 1-bedroom apartment in the Pearl District, and I get to walk to work most days, which beats sitting in traffic for 2 hours like my buddy Martin does. But there's something about turning 34 that makes you start asking those uncomfortable questions. You know the ones. Is this it? Am I where I thought I'd be? And the big one that kept me awake at night. Why does everyone my age seem to have their romantic life figured out while I'm still trying to work up the courage to talk to attractive women without stumbling over my words? I've always been what you might call a late bloomer when it comes to relationships. In high school, while my friends were asking girls to prom, I was the guy who helped them write their texts because apparently I was good with words, but not good enough to use them for myself. College wasn't much better. I had a few relationships, here and there, but nothing that lasted longer than a few months. There was Sarah in my junior year who broke up with me because she said I was emotionally unavailable, which was probably true. Then there was Katie after graduation, who decided she wanted someone more adventurous, which apparently meant someone willing to go bungee jumping on a Tuesday afternoon, rather than someone who preferred bookstores and quiet coffee shops. The truth is, I've always been cautious about everything. My career, my money, my friendships, and especially my heart. My mom used to say I was an old soul, which I think was her polite way of saying I was boring. My dad, more direct as always, would just shake his head and tell me to take some risks, son, before life passes you by. Easy for him to say. He met my mom when they were both 22 and married her 6 months later. They're still together 35 years later, still finishing each other's sentences and sharing inside jokes that make the rest of us roll our eyes. Me? I analyze everything to death. I research restaurants for weeks before trying them. I read reviews of movies before deciding if they're worth my time. I even researched my apartment for 3 months before signing the lease, creating spreadsheets comparing neighborhood crime rates and proximity to grocery stores. So when it comes to dating, you can imagine how that goes. By the time I've worked up the courage to ask someone out, they've usually moved on to someone who doesn't need a PowerPoint presentation to decide if they're compatible. My friends, and I use that term loosely because I really only have 3 close ones, have tried everything to get me out of my shell. There's Martin, my college roommate who now works in tech and makes more money than he knows what to do with. He's the kind of guy who sets up dating app profiles for fun and goes on 3 different dates in a week. Then there's Simon, who I met through work and who has this annoying habit of being right about everything, especially when it comes to my love life. He's the one who keeps telling me I'm overthinking everything and need to just put myself out there. And finally there's Bram, my neighbor and probably the most laid-back person I've ever met. He's a freelance photographer who somehow manages to attract interesting women without even trying, which makes him both inspiring and incredibly frustrating to be around. These 3 have made it their mission to help me find someone, which mostly involves a lot of unsolicited advice and the occasional setup that ends in disaster. Like the time Martin introduced me to his coworker's sister, who spent the entire dinner talking about her ex-boyfriend's motorcycle and how much she missed riding. Or when Simon thought I'd hit it off with someone from his yoga class, only to discover she was looking for someone to join her polyamorous relationship. And don't get me started on Bram's idea of a perfect match. a woman who collected vintage mannequins and wanted to show me her collection on the first date. But despite all their failed attempts at playing matchmaker, I appreciate that they care. Even if their methods are questionable, they've never stopped believing that I'll find someone who gets me. Someone who appreciates quiet conversations over loud parties, who thinks spending Saturday afternoon in a bookstore sounds better than bar hopping, and who won't mind that I still get nervous ordering food over the phone. Portland is supposed to be a great city for meeting people. Everyone says so. Keep Portland weird and all that. There are coffee shops on every corner, bookstores that host reading events, farmers markets where you can strike up conversations about organic vegetables. In theory, it should be perfect for someone like me. In practice, I usually end up going to the same 3 places, ordering the same things, and smiling politely at the same baristas who probably think I'm either very shy or slightly strange. That's where I was in my life that Tuesday afternoon in October when everything changed. Just another day of being cautious, predictable Dylan, browsing the travel section at Powell's Books, not because I had any immediate plans to travel, but because I liked imagining what it would be like to be the kind of person who booked spontaneous trips to places with names I couldn't pronounce. I had no idea that in about 10 minutes, a woman named Diana would walk into my life and challenge everything I thought I knew about taking chances. Powell's Books on a Tuesday afternoon in October has this particular quality of light that makes everything feel a little magical, like you're in some indie movie where meaningful encounters happen between the poetry and philosophy sections. The autumn rain was doing its Portland thing outside, not quite drizzling, not quite stopping. And I was in my element, surrounded by travel guides I'd never use and memoirs of people braver than I'd ever be. I was holding a book about hiking through New Zealand when I heard her laugh. Not the polite bookstore laugh that most people do when they're trying to be quiet, but a real, full-bodied laugh that made me look up from my imaginary adventure planning. She was standing in the biography section, holding what looked like a book about some obscure artist, and she was genuinely amused by something she'd read. The first thing I noticed wasn't her age. I'm terrible at guessing ages anyway. But the way she carried herself, confident without being intimidating, like someone who'd figured out that life was too short to pretend to be someone else. She had shoulder-length auburn hair with just hints of silver that caught the bookstore's warm lighting, and she was wearing this emerald green sweater that looked expensive but not flashy. Classy, I guess you'd call it. The kind of woman who probably had her life together in ways I was still figuring out. I went back to my book, telling myself to stop staring like some creepy bookstore lurker, but I kept stealing glances. She moved through the sections with purpose, like she knew exactly what she was looking for, occasionally pulling books out and examining them with the kind of attention I usually reserved for analyzing freelance contract details. Then came the moment that changed everything. I was reaching for a guidebook about Iceland, because apparently my fantasy life involved freezing my ass off looking at waterfalls, when my elbow knocked into a display of local poetry collections. Books scattered everywhere, creating the kind of noise that makes everyone in a quiet bookstore turn and stare. Classic Dylan move. Oh shit, I muttered, immediately dropping to my knees to gather the books, my face burning with embarrassment. Language, came an amused voice above me. I looked up to see the woman from the biography section standing there, smiling down at my disaster zone. Though I think the poets would appreciate the emotional honesty. She knelt down and started helping me collect the scattered volumes, and I noticed her hands. No wedding ring, which my brain immediately filed away as relevant information, though I told myself it probably wasn't. Thanks, I said, trying to stack the books in some semblance of order. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I have a special talent for making scenes in quiet places. It's a valuable skill, she said, handing me a collection of Maya Angelou poems. Keeps life interesting. We stood up together, and that's when I got a real look at her face. She was beautiful, but not in the way that magazines define beautiful. There were lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter, and probably some tears, and something in her expression that suggested she'd lived enough life to find genuine humor in a stranger's clumsiness. I'm Dylan, I said, because standing there, in awkward silence, felt worse than potential rejection. Diana, she replied, extending her hand. Her handshake was firm, direct. And you're either very brave or very clumsy to take on that display. Definitely clumsy, I admitted. Though I like to think there's some bravery in admitting it. She laughed again, and I felt something shift in my chest. It was the kind of laugh that made you want to say funnier things, just to hear it again. So, I said, gesturing at the books in her arms. Finding everything you're looking for? Actually, I was looking for something about Georgia O'Keeffe, for a project I'm working on. But I got distracted by a fascinating biography of Josephine Baker. She held up the book she'd been laughing at earlier. Did you know she once walked a pet cheetah down the Champs-Élysées? I did not know that, I said, genuinely charmed by this random piece of information. That's either the most badass thing I've ever heard, or the most irresponsible. Why not both? Diana said with a grin. I'm starting to think the best stories come from moments when people threw caution to the wind. There was something in the way she said it that made me think she wasn't just talking about Josephine Baker. And maybe it was the bookstore magic. Or maybe it was the way she'd help me clean up my mess without making me feel like an idiot. But I felt a surge of something I hadn't experienced in years, the desire to take a chance. Speaking of throwing caution to the wind, I heard myself say, I have to admit something. If you were 45, I'd probably work up the courage to ask you out. Maybe over coffee, definitely somewhere I'm less likely to destroy property. The words were out before I could stop them, and immediately I wanted to crawl back into the travel section and hide behind a guidebook to somewhere very far away. What kind of person leads with age-related pickup lines? What was wrong with me? But Diana didn't look offended or confused. Instead, her smile got wider, more mischievous, like I'd just said something that delighted, rather than horrified her. Well, she said, her eyes sparkling with amusement. I'm 52. Does that change anything? The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. I could feel my face going red again, but this time it wasn't just embarrassment. It was the sudden realization that I'd just stumbled into something I hadn't expected and wasn't sure I was prepared for. I started, then stopped, because my usual overthinking brain had apparently short-circuited. Here was this incredible woman, confident and funny and beautiful, who just turned my awkward attempt at flirting into something much more interesting. Does it? She pressed, clearly enjoying my obvious internal struggle. And that's when something clicked. Maybe it was the way she'd helped me with the books, or the story about the cheetah, or just the fact that she was standing there waiting for an honest answer instead of walking away from my ridiculous comment. But I realized that the number didn't matter nearly as much as the person asking the question. No, I said, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. No, it doesn't change anything. Except maybe it makes the coffee invitation more intimidating because you probably have much better taste in cafes than I do. Diana's smile was radiant. Well then, Dylan, who destroys poetry displays and asks women out based on age brackets, I think we should test that theory. If there's one thing I've learned about my friends, it's that they have an uncanny ability to appear exactly when you need them least and want them most. Case in point, I was sitting in my apartment at 8 p.m. that same Tuesday, staring at Diana's phone number in my contacts like it was some kind of ancient riddle I needed to decode, when my doorbell rang. Please tell me you have food, came Bram's voice through the intercom. I've been shooting a wedding all day and I'm pretty sure I've forgotten how to eat real food. I buzzed him up, and within minutes my apartment was invaded by all three of my self-appointed life coaches. Bram arrived first, camera bag slung over his shoulder and that perpetually relaxed expression that made him look like he'd just woken up from the world's most peaceful nap. Martin showed up 2 minutes later with Thai takeout and his usual manic energy from too much coffee and too many meetings. Simon wandered in last, carrying his yoga mat and radiating that zen-like calm that came from actually having his life together. Intervention time, Martin announced, setting food containers on my coffee table with the efficiency of someone who'd clearly planned this ambush. Bram texted us about seeing you at Powell's today, talking to a woman who wasn't running away from you. You were spying on me? I asked, though I wasn't really surprised. Bram had this talent for being everywhere without anyone noticing. I was photographing the poetry reading in the Rose Room, Bram said, settling into my armchair like he owned it. But yeah, I may have noticed you making a spectacle of yourself in the travel section. Who was she? I found myself telling them about Diana, about the scattered books and the conversation about Josephine Baker and her pet cheetah, and especially about my ridiculous age-related pickup line that somehow hadn't ended in complete disaster. My friends listened with the kind of attention usually reserved for really good TV shows or major sporting events. Wait, Martin interrupted, nearly choking on his pad thai. You actually said, if you were 45, I'd ask you out? Those words came out of your mouth? It was a moment of temporary insanity, I defended myself. I wasn't thinking clearly. That's the best part, Simon said, looking genuinely impressed. You finally stopped overthinking and just said something honest. How did she respond? Told them about Diana's response, about the way she'd smiled when she told me she was 52, about how she'd seemed amused rather than offended by my awkwardness. As I talked, I realized how much the conversation had meant to me, how natural it had felt despite being completely outside my comfort zone. This is huge, Bram said, leaning forward with the kind of intensity he usually reserved for getting the perfect shot. You met someone who can handle your particular brand of weirdness. That's like finding a unicorn. She's probably way out of my league, I said, voicing the fear that had been nagging at me all evening. I mean, she's got 18 years of life experience on me. What could I possibly offer someone like that? Martin rolled his eyes so hard, I was surprised they didn't fall out of his head. Dylan, you're an idiot. Age is just a number. What matters is connection, and it sounds like you two had it in spades. Easy for you to say, I countered. You date people who think a wild Friday night is trying a new craft brewery. This is different territory. That's when Simon, who'd been unusually quiet, spoke up. You know what your problem is? You're already talking yourself out of it before you've even tried. You're creating obstacles that don't exist yet. Simon had this annoying habit of being right about things, especially when it came to my self-sabotaging tendencies. He was the kind of person who approached life with Buddhist-level acceptance, while somehow managing to get everything he wanted without appearing to try very hard. What's her story? Bram asked, practical as always. I mean, what does she do? What's her situation? I realized I didn't know much about Diana beyond the fact that she was researching Georgia O'Keeffe for some kind of project and had an encyclopedic knowledge of fascinating historical figures. She mentioned a project, but I don't know what kind. I was too busy trying not to say something stupid to ask the right questions. See, this is why you need to actually call her, Martin said, pulling out his phone. Right now, while we're here to provide moral support and prevent you from chickening out. I can't call her with you three staring at me like I'm performing in some kind of social experiment, I protested. Then we'll go to the kitchen, Simon offered. But we're not leaving until you make contact. This is too important to let your anxiety brain take over. The thing about having friends who've known you for years is that they can see right through your excuses. They knew that left to my own devices, I'd spend the next week crafting the perfect text message that would somehow convey exactly the right amount of interest without seeming desperate, and then probably delete it without sending. What if she was just being polite? I asked, grasping for reasonable objections. What if she gave me her number because she felt bad about my obvious social awkwardness? Then you'll find out, Bram said simply, but you'll never know if you don't try. Martin was already pulling up my contacts, scrolling to Diana's name. Look, here's what's going to happen. You're going to send her a text, something simple. Reference the bookstore, suggest coffee, give her an easy out if she's not interested. What kind of text? I asked, feeling my palms start to sweat. How about this? Simon suggested, and I could practically see the meditation breathing techniques he was employing to stay patient with me. Hi Diana, it's Dylan from Powell's today. I realized I never got to hear the end of your Josephine Baker story. Any interest in continuing the conversation over coffee? It was perfect. Casual but interested, specific enough to show I'd been paying attention, with a built-in conversation starter. The kind of message I would have spent 3 hours crafting. On my own. That's actually not terrible, I admitted. It's brilliant, Martin corrected. It shows you were listening, it's not too eager, and it gives her something to respond to. Bram nodded approvingly. Plus, if she says no, you know it's not because you said something weird. Well, weirder than you already said. Thanks for the vote of confidence, I said, but I was already typing the message into my phone. My friends retreated to the kitchen, though I could hear them whispering and occasionally erupting in what sounded like poorly suppressed laughter. I stared at the message for a full minute before hitting send. Then, I immediately wanted to throw my phone across the room and pretend this whole day had never happened. "It's done," I called out. And within seconds they were back in the living room, looking at me like proud parents whose kid had just taken his first steps. "How do you feel?" Simon asked. "Like I might throw up," I admitted. "But also kind of excited? Is that normal?" "Completely normal," Bram assured me. "That's what taking risks feels like when you're out of practice." My phone buzzed. We all stared at it like it might explode. "Well?" Martin demanded. "What does it say?" I picked up the phone with shaking hands and read the message aloud. "Hi, Dylan. I was just thinking about that poetry display you attacked. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Georgia O'Keeffe over coffee. How's Thursday afternoon?" The silence in my apartment was deafening for about 3 seconds before all 3 of my friends erupted in celebration like their favorite team had just scored the winning goal. "She wants to see you again," Martin shouted, doing what appeared to be some kind of victory dance. "She referenced the poetry thing," Bram pointed out, grinning. "She's got a sense of humor about your disasters." "Thursday afternoon," Simon said thoughtfully. "That's not a typical date time. It's more like intentional conversation time. I like her already." As my friends continued their analysis of Diana's text message like it was a piece of literature, I found myself smiling. For the first time in years, I was looking forward to something that scared me. And judging by my friends' reactions, that was exactly the kind of problem worth having. Thursday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp October weather that makes Portland look like it belongs in a coffee commercial. I'd chosen Stumptown Coffee on Division Street, partly because it was neutral territory, and partly because I figured if things went badly, at least I'd be somewhere with excellent coffee to console myself with afterward. I arrived 15 minutes early because that's what anxious people do, and spent the time rehearsing conversation topics in my head while trying to look casual. I'd gone through 3 different outfit changes that morning, finally settling on dark jeans and a navy sweater that Martin had once said made me look approachable, but not desperate. I wasn't entirely sure what that meant, but it felt like the right vibe for a Thursday afternoon coffee date with a woman who probably had more life experience than my entire friend group combined. Diana walked in exactly on time, and I felt that same flutter in my chest that I'd experienced at Powell's. She was wearing a burgundy leather jacket over a cream-colored blouse, and her hair was pulled back in a way that revealed small silver earrings that caught the light. She looked effortlessly put together in that way that made me wonder if some people were just born knowing how to exist in the world without constantly second-guessing themselves. "Dylan," she said, approaching my table with a smile that immediately put me at ease. "I hope you haven't been waiting long." "Just got here," I lied, standing up to greet her. "Can I get you something? I mean, obviously coffee, but what kind?" "Surprise. Me," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "I trust your judgment." It was such a simple statement, but it carried weight. When was the last time someone had trusted my judgment about anything, let alone someone I was actively trying to impress? I ordered her a cortado, figuring it struck the right balance between sophisticated and approachable, and got myself a regular drip coffee because my hands were already shaky enough without adding extra espresso to the mix. When I returned to the table, Diana was looking around the cafe with the kind of appreciation that suggested she was genuinely interested in her surroundings, rather than just killing time. "This place has good energy," she said. "I can see why you chose it. Very Portland, but not trying too hard to be Portland, if that makes sense." "It does," I said, surprised by how perceptive she was. I was worried about picking somewhere too trendy or too boring. "The fact that you put thought into it is what matters," Diana said, taking a sip of her cortado. "Oh, this is perfect. Good choice." We fell into conversation more easily than I'd expected. Diana told me about her work as a freelance art curator, how she'd spent the last few years organizing exhibitions for smaller galleries and museums around the Pacific Northwest. The Georgia O'Keeffe research was for an upcoming show she was putting together about women artists who'd been overlooked or undervalued during their lifetimes. "It's fascinating work," she said, her eyes lighting up as she talked about it. "You get to be part detective, part storyteller, part advocate. Every piece has a history, and sometimes that history has been deliberately obscured or forgotten. I found myself genuinely interested, asking questions about how she'd gotten into the field, what her most challenging exhibition had been, whether she'd always been drawn to art, or if it was something she'd discovered later. Diana answered thoughtfully, but she also turned the questions back to me in a way that felt natural rather than perfunctory. "What about you?" she asked. "Graphic design must have its own storytelling elements. What kind of stories are you telling?" I laughed, probably a little too self-deprecatingly. "Mostly stories about dental hygiene and the benefits of organic dog food. Not exactly riveting narrative work." "But you must have projects you're more passionate about," Diana pressed gently. "What would you be working on if you could choose anything?" It was a question I hadn't been asked in years, and it caught me off guard. I found myself telling her about a book design project I'd been working on in my spare time. Nothing serious, just something for a local author who couldn't afford a professional designer. It was a collection of essays about growing up in small-town Oregon, and I'd been experimenting with incorporating hand-drawn elements that reflected the rural landscape. "That sounds beautiful," Diana said, and I could tell she meant it. "Do you have any pictures?" I pulled out my phone, feeling slightly embarrassed, but also excited to share something I'd been keeping to myself. Diana studied the images I showed her, asking thoughtful questions about my design choices, and nodding appreciatively at details I wasn't sure anyone else would notice. "You have a really good eye," she said finally. "This feels like it captures something essential about the stories inside. Have you thought about doing more work like this?" "Not really," I admitted. "I mean, it doesn't exactly pay the bills." "But it feeds something else," Diana said, meeting my eyes. "That's important too." There was something in her tone that made me think she was speaking from experience, like she understood the tension between practical necessity and creative fulfillment. It occurred to me that this was what I'd been missing in previous relationships. Someone who could see the parts of me I'd learned to downplay, who didn't make me feel like I had to choose between being responsible and being myself. "Can I ask you something?" Diana said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "Of course. That comment you made at Powell's about asking me out if I were 45. What made you say that? I mean, what was it about that specific number?" I felt my face warm, but Diana was looking at me with curiosity rather than judgment. Honestly, I think 45 felt like a compromise number to my anxious brain. Old enough to seem mature and worldly, young enough that the age gap wouldn't feel completely ridiculous. It was like I was negotiating with myself about what I thought I deserved. Diana tilted her head, considering this. "And what do you think you deserve?" It was the kind of question that cut straight to the heart of things, the kind I usually deflected, with humor or changed the subject to avoid. But something about Diana's direct gaze and the way she'd listened to me talk about my work made me want to try being honest. "I don't know," I said. "I guess I'm still figuring that out." "Well," Diana said, raising her coffee cup in a small toast, "here's to figuring it out together." The first sign that things might not be as straightforward as I'd hoped came 3 days after our coffee date, in the form of a text message that arrived while I was sitting in a client meeting about a particularly uninspiring brochure for a podiatrist's office. "Hey, just wanted to give you a heads up. My daughter Selena is in town this weekend. She's protective. Fair warning. Diana." I stared at the message, trying to decode what protective meant in this context. Was this Diana's way of testing whether I was serious about getting to know her, or was she warning me that I was about to face some kind of maternal interrogation process? Either way, the casual mention of a daughter my age, because let's face it, if Diana was 52, her daughter was probably somewhere in my general demographic, made the reality of our situation hit me in a way that our easy coffee conversation somehow hadn't. Martin found me that evening sitting on my couch, staring at my phone like it contained the answers to life's great mysteries. "You look like someone who's just realized he's in over his head," Martin observed, helping himself to a beer from my fridge without asking. "What happened?" I showed him Diana's text, and watched his eyebrows climb toward his hairline. "Oh," he said. "Oh, shit. That's helpful, thanks." "No, I mean, this is good," Martin said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "She's being upfront about her life. That's what adults do. It's just..." Are you ready to be involved with someone who has adult children? It was a question I hadn't let myself think about seriously. In my head, Diana existed in this perfect bubble where she was just this fascinating, attractive woman who laughed at my jokes and appreciated my design work. I hadn't really considered the full scope of what dating her would mean. The family, dynamics, the different life stages, the fact that while I was still figuring out how to be a functional adult, she'd already raised one. I don't know, I admitted. But I guess I'm about to find out. The meeting was set for Sunday brunch at a place called Tasty and Alder, which felt appropriately neutral, but also slightly intimidating because it was the kind of restaurant where people went for important conversations. Diana had suggested it, saying that Selena was a foodie and would appreciate the menu, which made me wonder if I was being evaluated not just as a potential romantic interest, but as someone with acceptable taste in dining establishments. I arrived exactly on time to find Diana already seated at a table with a woman who was unmistakably her daughter. Selena had Diana's bone structure and the same intelligent eyes, but where Diana radiated a kind of settled confidence, Selena had an energy that felt more like controlled intensity. She was probably around 30, dressed in the kind of effortlessly stylish way that suggested she worked in something creative, and she was looking at me with the kind of frank assessment that made me feel like I was about to take a test I hadn't studied for. "Selena, this is Dylan," Diana said as I approached the table. "Dylan, my daughter Selena." "The guy from the bookstore," Selena said, extending her hand with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mom's told me about your dramatic entrance into her life." "She's being generous," I said, sitting down across from them. "I'm pretty sure catastrophic would be more accurate." Selena's smile became slightly more genuine. "Well, at least you're honest about it." The conversation started safely enough. Selena worked as a freelance journalist, specializing in arts and culture writing, which explained both her sharp intelligence and her apparent skill at asking probing questions disguised as casual conversation. She'd just moved back to Portland after several years in Seattle and was staying with Diana while she looked for her own place. "So," Selena said after we'd ordered, cutting straight to what was clearly the point of this meeting. "Mom says you're 34. "That's correct," I said, trying not to sound defensive. "And you work in graphic design." "Also correct." "Have you ever been married?" "Selena," Diana interjected, but her daughter held up a hand. "These are reasonable questions, Mom. You're dating someone 18 years younger than you. I'm allowed to be curious about his life experience." She wasn't wrong exactly, but there was something in her tone that made me feel like I was being interviewed for a job I wasn't qualified for. I glanced at Diana, who looked slightly embarrassed but not surprised by her daughter's directness. "No, I've never been married," I said. "I've had relationships, but nothing that led to that kind of commitment." "Why not?" Selena asked. It was the kind of question that would have sent me into a spiral of self-doubt a week ago. But something about the way Diana was watching me, not with judgment, but with genuine curiosity about how I'd handle this, made me want to give an honest answer. Because I was always waiting for some perfect moment or perfect person, and I was too scared of making a mistake to take any real risks, I said. Which is probably why I'm 34 and having this conversation instead of being safely settled with someone my own age. Selena studied me for a moment, and I could practically see her recalibrating her assessment. "That's actually a pretty self-aware answer," she admitted. "I have good friends who don't let me get away with lying to myself," I said. "What do your friends think about you dating my mom?" I thought about Martin's initial shock, Simon's philosophical acceptance, and Bram's enthusiastic support. "They think I'd be an idiot not to see where this goes. They also think your mom is probably too good for me, but they're hoping she hasn't figured that out yet." Despite herself, Selena laughed. "Okay, that's also a good answer." Diana reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "He's full of good answers. It's one of the things I like about him." The gesture was small, but it felt significant in front of Selena. It was Diana's way of saying that whatever her daughter's concerns might be, she was choosing to move forward with this. Selena noticed too, and something in her expression softened. "Look," Selena said, leaning forward slightly. "I don't have a problem with the age thing necessarily, but my mom has been through some stuff, and I don't want to see her get hurt by someone who's just experimenting or trying to figure out what he wants." I understand that, I said. And I can't promise I won't hurt her, because that's not something anyone can promise. But I can promise that I'm not experimenting. Whatever this is, I'm taking it seriously. Selena nodded slowly. Okay, that's all I needed to hear. The rest of brunch passed more easily, with Selena relaxing enough to share some genuinely funny stories about her journalism adventures, and Diana looking visibly relieved that her daughter and whatever I was weren't going to spend the meal circling each other like suspicious cats. As we were leaving, Selena pulled me aside while Diana was getting her coat. She really likes you, Selena said quietly. I haven't seen her this excited about someone in years. Just don't waste that, okay? It was both a blessing and a warning, and I appreciated the directness of it. I won't, I said, and meant it. The week following the Selena interrogation, Diana and I fell into something that felt dangerously close to a routine. Not the kind of routine that kills romance, but the comfortable kind that suggests two people are actually starting to fit into each other's lives. She started texting me good morning messages with random art history facts. Did you know Van Gogh only sold one painting in his lifetime? And I found myself looking forward to those little bursts of knowledge almost as much as I looked forward to seeing her name on my phone. Our second official date happened almost by accident. Diana had mentioned she was going to the Portland Art Museum to research some pieces for her upcoming exhibition, and I'd jokingly offered to tag along as her assistant curator. To my surprise, she'd taken me up on it. Fair warning, she said as we walked through the museum's entrance on a rainy Saturday afternoon. I get very intense about art. I've been known to stand in front of a single painting for 45 minutes. That's okay, I said. I get very intense about fonts. We all have our obsessions. The museum was quieter than usual, probably because of the weather, which gave us space to move through the galleries without feeling rushed. Diana moved through the spaces like she belonged there, stopping occasionally to point out details I would have missed entirely. Look at the brushwork here, she said, standing in front of a landscape painting that seemed pretty standard to my untrained eye. See how loose it gets toward the edges? That's not laziness. That's the artist understanding that the human eye focuses on the center of the composition, and everything else can be suggested, rather than explicitly rendered. I found myself genuinely fascinated, not just by the art, but by watching Diana engage with it. She had this way of talking about paintings that made them come alive, like she was introducing me to old friends rather than explaining abstract concepts. You're really good at this, I said as we moved into the contemporary section. Making art accessible without dumbing it down. That's the job, Diana said, but I could tell she was pleased by the compliment. Art is supposed to communicate something. If it's not connecting with people, then either the art isn't working, or the presentation isn't working. We spent nearly 3 hours wandering through the galleries, and I realized this was the longest I'd ever spent in a museum without checking my phone or feeling restless. When Diana did her promised 45-minute deep dive into a Rothko painting, I found myself studying her profile as much as the canvas, watching the way her expression shifted as she noticed different elements. What are you thinking about? I asked when she finally stepped back from the painting. Color theory mostly, she said, but also about how brave it is to make art that's purely about feeling rather than representation. Rothko was trying to create these emotional experiences through color and form alone. Is it working? I asked. Diana looked at me curiously. What do you mean? Are you having an emotional experience? She considered this seriously, which was one of the things I was learning to love about her. She treated questions with respect, even silly ones. Yeah, she said finally. I am. It's making me feel hopeful, maybe? Like there's more depth to things than what you see on the surface. Something in the way she said it made me think she wasn't just talking about the painting. After the museum, we grabbed dinner at a small Italian place nearby. The conversation had shifted into more personal territory, the kind of sharing that happens when you've spent several hours in comfortable silence together and feel safe enough to fill it with real thoughts. Can I ask you something that might be too personal? Diana said, twirling pasta around her fork. After the Selena experience, I think we're past worrying about too personal, I said. Fair point. She smiled. What's the longest relationship you've been in? I had to think about it. 2 years, maybe? Her name was Jessica. We met in college and dated through most of our senior year and a little after graduation. What happened? We grew apart, I guess. Or maybe we were never really together in the first place. We were comfortable, but we weren't. I don't know how to explain it. We weren't curious about each other. Diana nodded thoughtfully. Curiosity is underrated in relationships. People focus on compatibility and shared interests. But if you're not genuinely interested in how the other person's mind works, you're just keeping each other company. Is that what happened in your marriage? I asked, then immediately worried I'd overstepped. Sorry, you don't have to answer that. It's okay, Diana said. And yes, partly. Michael and I were together for 15 years, married for 12 of them. We were compatible on paper. Similar backgrounds, shared goals. We wanted the same kind of life. But somewhere along the way, we stopped being curious about each other. We became like pleasant roommates who happened to share a child. That sounds lonely, I said. It was. Which is why I'm probably being overly cautious about this. She gestured between us. I don't want to make the same mistakes. What mistakes specifically? Diana was quiet for a moment, considering her answer, settling for comfortable instead of holding out for extraordinary, assuming that because something works on the surface, it's working underneath. Not asking for what I actually need because I was afraid it was too much. The honesty in her voice made my chest tight. What do you need? Someone who sees me, she said simply. Not just the curator or the mom or the woman who has her life together. Someone who's interested in the messy, complicated parts too. I reached across the table and took her hand. I want to see all of it. Diana's eyes welled up slightly, and she squeezed my fingers. That's terrifying and wonderful. The good stuff usually is, I said, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. Later, as we walked back to our cars, Diana stopped suddenly and turned to face me. Dylan, she said, I need you to know that this is real for me. I'm not trying to relive my youth or prove something to myself. I'm here because I genuinely like who you are. I know, I said. And I need you to know that this isn't some fantasy about dating an older woman. I'm here because talking to you feels like the most natural thing in the world. We kissed then, standing under a streetlight in the museum district, and it felt like sealing a promise we were both still afraid to make out loud. When we pulled apart, Diana smiled. So what now? Now we see where this goes, I said. No pressure, no timeline. Just curiosity. I can work with curiosity, Diana said. As I drove home that night, I realized I'd crossed some invisible line. This wasn't just dating anymore. It was something that mattered. Something worth being scared about. And for the first time in my adult life, that didn't make me want to run. The first crack in our perfect bubble appeared 3 weeks later, at a gallery opening that Diana had invited me to. It was for a local artist whose work she was considering for her upcoming exhibition, and I'd been looking forward to it as a chance to see Diana in her professional element. What I hadn't expected was to walk into what felt like a reunion of Portland's art elite, where everyone seemed to know everyone else and had decades of shared history. Diana! Called out a tall man with graying hair and the kind of confident posture that screamed, successful creative professional. He approached us with the easy familiarity of someone who clearly had history with her. Robert, Diana said, and I caught something in her tone that I couldn't quite identify. How nice to see you. You look fantastic, Robert said, leaning in, to kiss her cheek in that European way that always made me feel awkward and American. It's been what, 6 months since the Henderson opening? Something like that, Diana said, and I noticed she stepped slightly closer to me. Robert, this is Dylan. Dylan. Robert Walsh. He owns Gallery 23 downtown. Robert's handshake was firm, and his smile was polite, but there was definitely an assessment happening behind his eyes. Dylan, nice to meet you. Are you in the arts as well? Graphic design, I said, trying to match his confidence and probably failing. Ah, Robert said, in the tone people use when they want to sound interested but clearly aren't. Commercial work? Before I could answer, he'd already turned back to Diana. I was hoping I could steal you for a moment, actually. There's someone here I think you should meet. Marcus Reed from the Seattle Contemporary. He's looking for a curator, For their summer exhibition. I watched Diana's face light up with genuine interest. Marcus is here? I'd love to meet him. Wonderful. Dylan, you don't mind if I borrow her briefly? Robert asked, though he was already guiding Diana away. Of course not, I said. Because what else could I say? I spent the next 20 minutes wandering around the gallery, looking at paintings that were interesting but not really speaking to me, and trying not to watch Diana across the room as she was introduced to various important-looking people. She was clearly in her element, animated, and engaged in a way that reminded me how much expertise and passion she brought to her work. But I also felt increasingly out of place. The conversations around me were full of references to artists and exhibitions I'd never heard of. Industry gossip about galleries and collectors, debates about art theory that went completely over my head. It was like being at a party where everyone was speaking a language I only partially understood. You look like someone who's wondering what he's gotten himself into, came a voice beside me. I turned to see a woman about Diana's age wearing the kind of statement jewelry that suggested she was someone important in this world. Is it that obvious? I asked. Only to someone who's been there, she said with a knowing smile. I'm Evie Morrison, by the way. I run the contemporary program at the university. Dylan, I said. I'm here with Diana. I figured as much. You have that deer in headlights but trying to be supportive look that significant others get at these things. She gestured around the room. Art world events can be pretty intimidating if you're not used to them. Diana mentioned there might be a lot of shop talk, I said. That's putting it mildly. Half these people have known each other for 20 years. The other half are trying to convince the first half that they matter. Evie studied me with frank curiosity. How long have you two been together? Not long, I admitted. A few weeks. And how are you finding it? Dating someone in this world? It was a direct question, and something about Evie's straightforward manner made me want to give an honest answer. Honestly, it's making me realize how different our professional lives are. Diana's accomplished things I can barely comprehend, and I design brochures for dental offices. Evie nodded thoughtfully. Can I give you some unsolicited advice? Please, don't diminish what you do. Good design matters. And Diana's smart enough to see value in things beyond just art world credentials. But, she paused, choosing her words carefully. You should also know that this world can be consuming. People get caught up in the networking, the politics, the constant need to be seen as relevant. It's not always easy to balance that with personal relationships. Before I could ask what she meant by that, Diana appeared at my side, slightly breathless, and clearly energized. Sorry that took so long, she said, slipping her arm through mine. Marcus was fascinating. He's doing this incredible series on Pacific Northwest indigenous artists. That sounds amazing, I said, and meant it. But I also noticed that she was still buzzing with professional excitement in a way that made me feel somehow peripheral to her real life. The ride home was quiet. Diana seemed lost in thought, probably processing all the connections she'd made and opportunities she'd heard about. I found myself staring out the window and wondering if this was what our future would look like. Me standing on the sidelines while she moved through a world where I'd always be the outsider. You're quiet, Diana said as we pulled into her driveway. Just thinking, I said. About what? I hesitated, not wanting to sound needy or insecure, but also knowing that we'd promised to be honest with each other. About whether I belong in your world. Diana turned off the engine and looked at me. What do you mean? Tonight was amazing to watch, I said carefully. Seeing you in your element, meeting all those people who clearly respect your work, but I also felt like I was tagging along to something I wasn't really part of. Diana was quiet for a long moment. I'm sorry if you felt excluded. I didn't mean for that to happen. It's not your fault, I said. It's just, we come from different places professionally. And I'm starting to wonder if that's going to be a problem. Dylan, Diana said, reaching for my hand. Your work matters too. What you do has value. I know that, I said. But it's not the same kind of value, is it? You preserve culture and help people understand beauty and meaning. I make things that help dentists get more customers. Those are both important, Diana said, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Are they, though? I asked. I mean, really? We sat in the car in silence, both of us struggling with a question that felt bigger than just our different careers. It was about worlds and status and whether love could bridge gaps that sometimes felt more like chasms. "I don't know how to answer that," Diana said finally, "but I know that I care about you, and I don't want our different backgrounds to become a wall between us." "Neither do I," said. "I just don't know how to prevent it." As I drove home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just encountered our first real obstacle. Not family disapproval or age differences, but something more fundamental about who we were and where we fit in each other's lives. And I wasn't sure either of us knew how to solve it. The universe has a twisted sense of humor. Just when Diana and I were navigating our professional differences, Portland's surprisingly small social circles decided to weigh in on our relationship. It started innocently enough. A casual mention at my regular coffee shop. A sideways glance at the grocery store. The kind of low-level social radar that every city has when people start pairing off in unexpected ways. The first real confrontation came from an unexpected source. My own mother. "Dylan, honey," she said during our weekly phone call, using that tone that meant she was about to say something I wouldn't want to hear. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned she saw you at the farmer's market." "With an older woman?" Mrs. Patterson was our former neighbor who had apparently made it her retirement hobby to monitor the romantic lives of everyone she'd ever met. I should have known this was coming. "Her name is Diana, Mom. And yes, she's older than me." "How much older?" The question came out faster than she'd probably intended. "Does it matter?" "Of course it matters, sweetheart. I just want to make sure you're not getting in over your head." I found myself having the same conversation with my father 2 days later. Except his approach was more direct. "Son, are you sure you know what you're doing?" he asked during one of our rare lunch meetings downtown. "Dating someone that much older, it comes with complications." "What kind of complications?" "Different life stages, different priorities. She's probably thinking about settling down, retirement planning, grandchildren maybe. You're just getting started." The assumption that Diana was some desperate older woman looking to trap a younger man into domestic bliss annoyed me more than I'd expected. "Dad, it's not like that. We're just seeing where things go." "I'm not trying to be negative," he said, but his expression suggested otherwise. "I just don't want you to get hurt, or to hurt someone else because you're not ready for what she needs." But the most uncomfortable encounter came at Martin's birthday party the following weekend. Diana had agreed to come with me, and I'd been looking forward to introducing her to more of my friends in a relaxed setting. What I hadn't anticipated was the way the room's energy shifted when we walked in together. It wasn't overt disapproval. My friends are too polite for that. But there were definitely some long looks, some whispered conversations that stopped when we approached, and a general sense that our relationship had become a topic of discussion before we'd even arrived. Taylor, Martin's girlfriend, was the first to actually address it directly. "Diana, it's so nice to finally meet you," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Dylan's told us so much about you." "All good things, I hope," Diana replied graciously. "Oh, absolutely. It's just, well, we were all so surprised when Dylan said he was dating someone. He's usually so cautious about relationships." There was something in Taylor's tone that made it clear she thought Diana was somehow taking advantage of my cautious nature, which made me want to jump in and defend both of us. But Diana handled it with more grace than I probably would have. "Dylan's caution is one of the things I admire about him," Diana said calmly. "Too many people rush into things without really thinking them through." The conversation moved on, but I could feel the undercurrent of judgment throughout the evening. When Diana went to the bathroom, Bram pulled me aside. "Dude, she's great," he said. "But are you sure about this?" "Sure about what?" "The whole thing. I mean, she's clearly smart and attractive, but—" He trailed off, searching for diplomatic words. "But what?" "She's just so established, like she has her whole life figured out. Don't you feel like you're playing catch-up?" It was exactly the fear I'd been trying not to think about. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Look, I'm not saying don't date her. I'm just saying, make sure you're doing it for the right reasons." Simon approached, while Bram was talking, and I could tell he'd overheard enough to know what the conversation was about. Can I offer a different perspective? Simon said in his typically thoughtful way. Maybe the question isn't whether Dylan is ready for Diana's life stage, but whether they're both ready to create something new together. What do you mean? Bram asked. I mean, maybe the point isn't that Dylan needs to catch up to where Diana is, or that Diana needs to slow down to where Dylan is. Maybe they meet somewhere in the middle and build something that works for both of them. It was a more optimistic take than I'd been hearing from anyone else, and I appreciated Simon's attempt to reframe the situation. But I could also see the doubt in Bram's eyes, and I knew it was probably reflected in other people's reactions too. The ride home with Diana was tense in a way our previous car rides hadn't been. Your friends are protective of you, Diana said finally. Is that a polite way of saying they don't approve? It's a way of saying they care about you and they're not sure I'm good for you. I glanced over at her. What do you think? I think they're asking reasonable questions. The same questions I've been asking myself. Like what? Like whether we're both being realistic about what this relationship means, whether we're considering the practical implications or just getting caught up in the novelty of it. Her honesty was both refreshing and terrifying. Are we getting caught up in novelty? Diana was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. I know that I care about you, and I know that spending time with you makes me happy. But I also know that other people's opinions affect how we see ourselves, whether we want them to or not. So what do? I think we keep being honest with each other, and we try not to let other people's fears become our fears. It sounded reasonable in theory, but as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the outside world was starting to creep into our relationship in ways that might be harder to ignore than we'd hoped. My parents' concerns, my friends' skepticism, the curious looks from strangers, they were all asking the same fundamental question. What were we really doing together? And the uncomfortable truth was, I wasn't entirely sure I had a good answer. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was sitting in my office, half-heartedly working on a logo design for a local bakery. Diana's name appeared on my phone, which wasn't unusual, but something in her voice when I answered told me this wasn't going to be one of our normal check-ins. Dylan, I need to tell you something, she said without preamble. Michael called. Michael, her ex-husband. The name I'd heard mentioned exactly twice in all our conversations, both times in passing references to their amicable divorce 3 years ago. Okay, I said carefully. What did he want? He's moving back to Portland. His company is relocating him here for a new project, and he wanted to give me a heads up because of Selena. I set down my coffee, suddenly needing my full attention for this conversation. When? Next month. Dylan, there's more. He wants to have dinner, to talk about things. What kind of things? Diana was quiet for a long moment. He said he's been thinking about us. About whether we gave up too easily. The words hit me like a physical blow. And what did you tell him? I told him I'm seeing someone now. But he asked if we could still have that conversation. As closure, he said. I stared out my office window at the Portland skyline, trying to process what this meant. Do you want to have that conversation? I don't know, Diana said honestly. Part of me thinks I owe it to myself to understand what went wrong. But part of me is scared that it will complicate everything. Everything meaning us? Everything meaning, yes, us. We agreed to meet that evening to talk about it in person, but the rest of my workday was a wash. I kept replaying Diana's words, trying to read meaning into her tone, analyzing whether this was the beginning of the end or just another obstacle we'd have to navigate together. When I arrived at Diana's house that evening, I could tell she'd been thinking about this all day too. She had that look people get when they've been turning a problem over in their mind without finding a solution. I'm sorry about this morning, she said as soon as I walked in. I probably should have waited to tell you in person. No, I'm glad you called. I need to understand what this means. We sat on her couch, the same one where we'd had so many easy conversations. But now there was a tension in the air that made everything feel different. Michael and I were together for 15 years, Diana said slowly. We have a child together, a whole history. I can't just pretend that doesn't matter. I'm not asking you to pretend anything, I said. I'm asking whether you still have feelings for him. It's not that simple, isn't it? Diana looked at me with something that might have been frustration. Dylan, you're asking me to categorize feelings that I've spent 3 years trying to understand myself. Michael was my partner for most of my adult life. Do I still love him? In some ways, yes. Am I in love with him? No. At least, I don't think so. The qualification at the end made my stomach drop. You don't think so? I thought I knew. But now that he wants to talk, now that he's questioning whether we made a mistake. She trailed off, looking lost. So you're going to have dinner with him? I think I have to. We sat in silence for a while, both of us trying to figure out how to navigate territory neither of us had mapped before. Finally, Diana spoke. I need you to know that this doesn't change how I feel about you. What we have is real, and it matters to me. But I also need to be honest about my past. If I don't deal with this now, it's going to keep hanging over us. I understood her logic, but that didn't make it easier to accept. When is this dinner happening? This weekend. And then what? Then I'll know for sure what I want. It wasn't the reassurance I'd been hoping for, but it was honest. As I drove home that night, I realized that our relationship was about to face its biggest test yet. Not external pressure from friends or family, but the return of Diana's past in the form of someone who'd known her longer than I'd been alive. For the first time since that day at Powell's Books, I wondered if I was about to lose something I'd never really had a right to keep. Saturday arrived with the kind of gray Portland weather that matched my mood perfectly. Diana had texted me that morning, just a simple thinking of you. But it felt loaded with the weight of what was about to happen. She was having dinner with Michael that evening, and I was supposed to just wait. I tried to distract myself with work, then with cleaning my apartment, then with a long walk through the neighborhood. Nothing worked. By 6 p.m., when I knew they were probably sitting down together at whatever restaurant they'd chosen, I was a mess. That's when my phone rang. Simon. Emergency friend intervention, he said when I answered. Martin and Bram are already here. We're ordering pizza and you're coming over. I'm fine, I lied. Dylan, you're sitting alone in your apartment while the woman you're falling in love with is having dinner with her ex-husband. You are definitively not fine. He wasn't wrong. 20 minutes later, I was on Simon's couch with a beer in my hand, and 3 of my closest friends looking at me with a mixture of concern and determination. Okay, Martin said, settling into his usual role as the direct one. Let's talk about worst-case scenarios. That's not helpful, Bram protested. Actually, it is, Simon said thoughtfully. Sometimes you have to face your fears to understand them. So we did. We talked about the possibility that Diana might realize she still loved Michael, that their shared history was too strong to overcome, that I was just a temporary detour in her real-life story. It was brutal, but it was also strangely liberating to say the fears out loud. But here's the thing, Simon said after we'd exhausted all the ways this could go wrong. Even if the worst happens, you took a chance on something real. That matters. Does it? I asked. If it ends badly, was it worth it? That's not the right question, Bram said, surprising me with his seriousness. The right question is, are you glad you tried? Because the alternative was spending the rest of your life wondering what might have been. My phone buzzed. A text from Diana. Can we talk? Are you home? The timestamp showed 9:47 p.m. Their dinner was over. She wants to talk, I said, my voice coming out rougher than I'd intended. Go, Martin said. Whatever she has to say, you need to hear it. The drive to Diana's house felt both endless and too short. I found myself rehearsing responses to conversations we hadn't had yet, trying to prepare for any possible outcome. When I pulled into her driveway, I could see her silhouette in the living room window, and my heart did something complicated in my chest. Diana opened the door before I could knock. She looked tired, but not devastated, which I took as either a good sign or a very bad one. How did it go? I asked, because pretending this hadn't dominated my entire evening felt impossible. It was clarifying, she said, stepping aside to let me in. We sat in her living room, the same space where we'd had so many conversations, But this one felt different, final somehow. "Michael wants to get back together," Diana said without preamble. "He thinks we could make it work this time. He's willing to do counseling, to address the issues that broke us up before." My stomach dropped, but I forced myself to ask the question that mattered. "And what do you want?" Diana looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I want to tell you about the conversation we had, about what he offered, and what I realized." "Okay," I said, bracing myself for whatever was coming next. He painted this picture of our future together. Familiar, stable, built on all this shared history, and for a moment, I could see it. The appeal of going back to something known, something that felt safe. I nodded, not trusting my voice. But then I realized something. Diana continued. "Safe isn't what I want anymore. I want someone who challenges me, who makes me curious about what comes next. I want someone who sees me as I am now, not as who I was 20 years ago." She reached for my hand, and I felt something tight in my chest begin to loosen. "Dylan, I choose you. I choose us. Not because it's easy or logical or what anyone expects, but because when I imagine my future, you're the person I want to figure it out with." The relief was so overwhelming I almost couldn't speak. "Are you sure?" I've never been more sure of anything in my life. We kissed then, and it tasted like relief and possibility and the promise of whatever came next. 6 months later, I was standing in front of my bathroom mirror at 6 a.m., trying to decide if the nervous energy coursing through my veins was excitement or pure terror. Today was the day Diana's exhibition opened, the one she'd been working on since before we met, featuring overlooked women artists of the Pacific Northwest. It was also the day I was planning to do something that would have been unthinkable to the cautious Dylan who'd knocked over that poetry display at Powell's. I was going to ask Diana to move in with me, not because we'd been together long enough that it seemed like the logical next step, and not because either of our leases was up or we needed to save money on rent, but because somewhere between her choosing me over Michael and watching her transform a collection of forgotten paintings into a celebration of artistic courage, I'd realized that I wanted to build a life with her, a real life, with shared decisions and morning coffee routines, and the kind of deep intertwining that scared the hell out of me and made me feel more alive than I'd ever felt. The exhibition opening was at 7 p.m., but Diana had been at the gallery since dawn, making final adjustments and probably second-guessing every curatorial decision she'd made over the past year. I'd offered to help, but she'd kissed me and told me she needed to do this part alone. "It's like sending your kid off to college," she'd said the night before. "You've done everything you can, and now you have to trust that it's enough." So instead of hovering at the gallery, I spent the day working on a project of my own. 3 weeks ago, Diana had mentioned in passing that she wished she had a proper catalog for the exhibition, something more substantial than the simple brochure the gallery budget allowed for. I'd been working on a full-scale publication ever since, combining professional photography of the artworks with Diana's research and essays, designing it to be something beautiful enough to honor both the artists and Diana's work in bringing their stories to light. It was the most personal project I'd ever undertaken, and definitely the most important. If Diana's exhibition was her way of saying these women artists mattered, this catalog was my way of saying Diana mattered, that her work mattered, that we mattered. At 6:30 p.m., I arrived at the gallery with a box containing 50 printed copies of the catalog and a stomach full of butterflies. The space was already filling with people, art collectors, gallery owners, journalists, and the kind of Portland cultural establishment that Diana moved through so effortlessly. But this time, I didn't feel like an outsider looking in. I felt like someone who belonged here because Diana belonged here, and I belonged with Diana. She found me near the entrance, looking radiant in a black dress that somehow managed to be both elegant and approachable, her eyes bright with the kind of energy that comes from seeing a long-held vision finally come to life. "You came," she said, as if there had been any doubt. "I brought you something," I said, handing her one of the catalogs. Diana's hands shook slightly as she opened it, her eyes moving over the layout, the typography, the way I'd arranged her words alongside the artwork images. When she looked up at me, her eyes were bright with tears. "Dylan, this is How did you— I had help from some photographer friends, and I may have spent my entire savings on printing costs, but I wanted you to have something that matched the importance of what you've done here. Diana kissed me then, right there in the middle of the gallery with half of Portland's art world watching, and I didn't care who saw or what they thought. "I love you," she whispered against my lips, and it was the first time either of us had said those words out loud. "I love you too," I whispered back. "And I want to ask you something important. But first, let's get through your opening." She pulled back to look at me, curiosity and affection mixing in her expression. "What kind of something important?" "The kind that can wait until we're celebrating properly." The evening was a triumph. Diana moved through the crowd with confidence and grace, explaining the stories behind each piece, connecting with visitors who were genuinely moved by what they were seeing. I watched her transform from the woman I'd fallen in love with into someone even more impressive, a curator, a storyteller, a force of cultural change. And when the last visitor left and we were alone in the gallery, surrounded by the art Diana had fought to bring into the light, I knew it was time. "Diana," I said, taking her hands, "move in with me. Not because it makes practical sense, but because I want to wake up next to you every morning and figure out this life thing together." She was quiet for a long moment, and for an instant I wondered if I'd misread everything. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that starts small and grows until it takes over her entire face. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." 1 year later, I'm sitting in our living room. Our living room, because that still gives me a little thrill to say, watching Diana work on her laptop while morning light streams through the windows. She's planning her next exhibition, this time focused on contemporary Pacific Northwest artists, and there's a stack of gallery submissions spread across our coffee table. "Listen to this," she says, looking up from her screen. "This artist in Eugene creates these incredible installations using recycled materials from old growth forests. She's basically turning environmental destruction into statements about renewal." I love watching Diana get excited about artists and their work. It's the same enthusiasm she had that first day at Powell's, except now I get to see it every day, in our shared space, as part of our shared life. The transition wasn't seamless. Moving in together meant negotiating everything from whose coffee maker to keep to how to arrange furniture that reflected both our tastes. Diana's sophisticated aesthetic and my more minimalist approach required some creative compromise, but we figured it out. Like we figured out most things. With patience, humor, and the occasional heated discussion about optimal closet organization. My friends have stopped asking if I'm sure about this relationship. Even my parents have come around, especially after meeting Diana at last month's family barbecue, where she charmed my mother by asking genuine questions about her garden and engaged my father in a lengthy discussion about the economics of small business ownership. The age difference that once felt so significant has become just another fact about us, like Diana's preference for herbal tea and my inability to function before my second cup of coffee. We're building something that belongs to neither her past nor my future, but to our present. A life that draws from both our experiences while creating something entirely new. Selena visits regularly now, and I've stopped feeling like I'm being evaluated every time she walks through the door. Last weekend, she brought her new boyfriend over for dinner, and it felt natural, familial even. Like we'd created our own version of what family looks like. "Remember that awful joke you made when we first met?" Diana asks, closing her laptop and curling up next to me on the couch. "About asking you out if you were 45. How could I forget?" I've been thinking about that lately. About how you qualified your interest based on some arbitrary number. Like you were negotiating with yourself about what you deserved. And I think maybe we both learned something about not letting other people's expectations limit what we think is possible. She's right. The cautious Dylan, who overthought every decision and let fear masquerade as practicality, couldn't have imagined this life. Not because of Diana's age or our different backgrounds, but because he couldn't conceive of taking a risk that mattered. "So what would you say now?" Diana asks with a smile. "About the age thing?" I consider this seriously, because she deserves a serious answer. I'd say that if you were any age, if you were any person other than exactly who you are, I wouldn't be interested. Because this isn't about numbers or timing or fitting into some predetermined idea of how relationships should work. This is about finding someone who makes you want to be braver than you thought you could be. Diana kisses me, and it still feels like the first time. Surprising, grateful, full of possibility. Sometimes the best things in life start with a stupid joke and a willingness to see what happens next. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.